Okay, so I'm going to talk you through the problem that I made up, just so that you have it to study from. So I made this system right here. I just made it up completely out of the blue. So let me show you the fastest way to solve it, and then we'll do it using matrices. Because even though both work, matrices definitely aren't the fastest way to solve it. So if you wanted the fastest way to solve it, what you're gonna do is just eliminate these y's. So when I take the first row and add it to the second row, 2x plus x is 3x. And then a positive y plus a negative y means that those are gone. And then 7 plus negative 1 is 6. And then just divide the 3 on both sides so you get x equals 2. Okay, so that's part of your answer. And then we also need to go figure out what y equals. So I'm going to go plug in the 2 for x in right here. And what I get, 2 times 2 is 4. And then I have plus y equals 7. And then to get y by itself, I'm just going to subtract the 4, subtract the 4. So I get y equals 3. Okay, so that's definitely the fastest way to solve it. X equals 2 and y equals 3. But like I said, they have to teach you how to do it in matrix form too. So it's the same exact thing, it's just going to take a lot longer. So what I did is I took the original system and then turned it into a matrix. So, and you do that just by using your coefficients. So a 2, a 1, and a 7 is your first row, and then a 1, a negative 1, and a negative 1 is my second row. Okay? And then remember, in order to get this solved, you want it in reduced row echelon form. So what that means is ones down the diagonal and zeros everywhere else. So you want uh, the last one to end up looking like this: ones down the diagonal and zeros everywhere else. But it's just going to take a little bit of work to get there. So when don't just go in any order. There's an order to this. The first thing you want to do is start here. So if you want that 2 to be a 1, what you're going to do is you're going to do 1/2 times row 1, and that's going to become your new row 1. So this is in our homework. This is how they would have you write it out, and then they would ask you to fill in that 1/2. Um, so if I take 1/2 times 2, that's 1. 1/2 times 1 is 1/2, and 1/2 times 7 is 7/2. And then remember that means that the first row changed, so the second row is not going to change. You can only change one at a time. So this second row right here, I just carried it down right here. Okay, so this right here, this is, remember how I said the order matters. The order that you get the zeros and the ones, that matters. So we got that one first, and then the next one I'm going to want is this one right here. And I want that to be a 0 because I want ones down the diagonal and 0 everywhere else. So what I did is I took row 2 and I subtracted row 1. So row 2 minus row 1, and then that turns into row 2. So my and that means that my row 2 is what's changing. So because the first one's not changing, I just copied it down. So 1, 1/2, and 7/2. That first row just repeats down here. But to get this 0 here, I'm going to do row 2 minus row 1, and then that's going to be my new row 2, because look, it's row 2 that's changing. So row 2 minus row 1. So 1 minus 1 is 0. Negative 1 minus 1/2. If you need to, use your calculator, but I'll take my word for it. Oh, negative 1 minus 1/2 is negative 3/2. And then negative 1 minus 7/2 is negative 9/2. Okay, so I'm halfway there. I got my 1 and my 0. And then the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to work on this number right here. And I want that to turn into a 1. Because, again, 1's down the diagonal. So what number do I need to multiply this by in order to turn it into a 1? Well, negative 2/3. You just like you said, you take the reciprocal. So negative 2/3 times row 2, and that's going to turn into my new row 2. So if I do that, again, row 1 is not changing. It's only row 2 that's changing. So row 1 just gets copied down. It's not going to change. You can only change one at a time. So negative 2/3 times 0 is still 0. And then negative 2/3 times negative 3/2 is 1. And then negative 2/3 times 9/2 is 3. Okay, so we're almost done. You have ones down the diagonal. You have this 0 here. So the last one we need to change is this. We need to turn this into a 0. So like I said, you want to start here, get a 1, and then work down. And then start here, this one as a 1, and work up. So in order to get this to be a 0, what I need to do, or I guess in order to get it to eliminate, that's probably the easier way to say it. So in order to eliminate this positive 1/2, I need to multiply this by negative 1/2. So I'm going to do negative 1/2 times row 2, and then I'm going to replace that answer into row 1. Because row 1 is the one that needs to change. I need a 0 here. So because row 1 is changing, that means that row 2 is going to stay the same. So my row 2, I just copied down right here. And then now we're going to do this rule and replace it with row 1. So negative 1/2 times row 2. Let's do that. So what's 0 times negative 1/2? 0. You know what? I'm forgetting. And then I'm going to do plus 1. I forgot that part. So negative 1/2 times 0 is 0. And then plus row 1. 0 plus 1 is still 1. And then here, what's negative 1/2 times 1? Negative 1/2. And then what's negative 1/2 plus 1/2? 0. Okay, and then here also, what's negative what's negative 1/2 times 3? Negative 3/2. And then what's that negative 3/2 plus 7/2? It's 4/2, and 4 divided by 2 is 2. Okay, so now that you have ones down the diagonal and zeros everywhere else, you're done. So you know that x equals 2 and y equals 3. Okay, so that's how you get your answer from matrix form. Remember, we already knew that's what it was from this, which took 15 seconds to solve, whereas the matrix is going to take probably close to 10 minutes when you're new at it. So same answer, just solving it 2 different ways. It's just unfortunately the matrix way takes a lot longer. But there's your explanation. So study from that, because it ends up taking even longer when it's like when they add a third equation. So if they do like x plus 2y equals 3, well now this matrix has a third row to it, and that ends up taking even longer. I just showed you one where it was 2 equations just so you could kind of get the basics down. Just kind of see the process with just 2 rows. But on your homework, they're likely going to give you 3 rows at some point. So just study from this, and then let me know if you have any questions.